the hip stretches you need to be doing. I'm Chris Mills with surfstrengthcoach.com. Hip mobility, it's an epicenter of movement, the hip, right? The ball and socket joint. And if you think about all the positions we find ourselves in surfing and want to get to, it's all movement around this pelvis, the pelvis rotating on the femur. It's meaning your hips need to move well. And so what we're gonna do today is give you an idea of the fundamentals you need to know, because on all of social media, you're seeing all this dynamic stuff, and some of it's legit, but a lot of people aren't there yet. So when they go into the dynamic stuff, they're potentially making things worse. So in clinic, in the gym setting, I see a lot of people coming off a decade or two of desk work, and things are kind of not quite right. There's knee stuff, there's back stuff. They need a really solid entrance point to start stretching the hips efficiently so they can get up to that dynamic stuff. So let's get into it. 3 fundamentals you really should be implementing. This can be at home, prior to training, before you get in surf. And if you want something that's really comprehensive, from fundamental stretches to tissue work to dynamic movement to then strengthening, check out the Surf Athlete app. You'll dig it. So what's vitally important is that this ball and socket joint has access to rotation. If you think of this kind of surf stance position, it is rotating this pelvis, generally around a fixed femur that's extending and compressing. We need a lot of good internal rotation of this trailing hip leg to get into this kind of valgus. It's efficient for surfing, but biomechanically it's not efficient. If you're lacking internal rotation, you're gonna really start tearing apart a knee. So we wanna make sure we have access to rotation. So you'll see all the dynamic, rotational stuff. We're getting into loaded stretching protocols, but what people need to first start with is this basic 90-90 position. Can you be here keeping a spine stable? What I mean by stable spine is, can you keep it in this neutral position? Or are you so limited on external rotation of this leg that you can only be here and be rounded, compensating at this low back? That's a problem, is that people generally don't have this basic external rotation of the front leg or abduction, bringing out to the side. This leg, and this is actually some internal rotation here. They're lacking these movements, but they're starting to go into dynamic protocols, and so it's all just doing funky stuff with the back. So generally what needs to happen is you need a pillow or a yoga block, something to prop that hip up so that you can now focus on keeping a nice long spine, right? This is a neutral spinal position, while getting into a good external rotation of that front hip, 90-degree off that side leg, and start to hinge forward at the hip joint. Notice I'm not rounding, right? I'm hinging forward, isolating the stretch to that posterior hip. And now I can start hitting different vectors. This is a basic fundamental stretch that you need to know how to implement, because it's the basis for all progressive loading or stretching of that hip joint. So again, I've got that 90-degree position, I'm coming forward, hitting different angles. I might breathe, good belly breathing, no pain face, no grimace. And if we want to start accessing internal rotation, we can lean back a bit and focus on, I'm bringing my chest to face over this lateral leg, but more so I'm wanting to bring my pelvis, because if I bring the pelvis here, but keep the knee fixed, the thigh fixed, it's driving into internal rotation. That's especially important on that trailing leg. So I'm a natural footer, so back leg. It's my right leg, which is actually can get stiff into internal rotation, so I will spend time working on this. So the basic 90-90, keep your spine nice and straight, prop the butt up if you need to, and get to the point where you can be here in these 90-degree angles comfortably. It might take time, okay? A lot of people will get a lot of cramping essentially through this glute medius, glute minimus, so you might need to do some tissue release with a tennis ball, get into this lateral hip complex. If you're really tight through the adductors, you might not be able to get here. And if everything is still really, really limited, you can go into a good old style figure 4 stretch, but understand this needs to progress to that 90-90. A way this gets butchered is you see here 90-90, I'm all good keeping the spine straight. If I go further forward, I've run out of hip range of motion, so I just flex the spine. This is what people are generally doing with their butchered pigeon poses, is that as soon as they lose this 90 degree and they bring this foot in, they're no longer hitting external rotation, okay? So they'll get into this pigeon pose where there's not a 90 degree bend. They'll get here and then they'll just flex the spine. I'm not saying pigeon pose is bad. I'm saying most guys, especially the older crew, don't have the mobility to get into a really good yoga, or the pigeon pose, right? So work on this 90-90 position. And then a progression of this into a pigeon pose is I just go from 90-90, I prop up, and then if I can, my back foot comes back slightly at an angle, and I drop the back hip this way, and I'm going after the posterior hip capsule. It's not some huge stretch, it's a deep stretch right into that capsule. This is where most people need to be, because here I can keep my spine neutral and isolate the hip rather than just rounding and not really isolating anything in a pigeon pose. So get to the point where you can own this 90-90 stretch. Adductors, groin muscles, okay? So again, we just want to have free range of motion through everything around that hip joint. So these adductors tend to get really beat up and tight. Super easy one. Set up, we call this half kneeling. Cool. Both knees. Bring one knee, foot out. My foot is in line with my knee. I block my knee from coming forward. I need to push it back to keep tension on these adductor muscles, and then I drop down. I'm not altering all of my torso position because I want to keep that pelvis pretty neutral. I feel that predominantly through these kind of higher groins. So it could be adductor brevis, pectineus, some adductor longus. Pulse out. You might get some stretching on this one as well. So always, both sides. This one I kind of generally will pulse down. This is a really good one prior to surfing because you're also starting to mobilize this hip into abduction. Cool. Good, simple, easy stretch. The hip flexor stretch. Now everybody goes for hip flexor stretches and generally just sacrifices the lumbar spine. It's important we know how to do this stretch so we can get into more dynamic hip flexor stretches. Reason it's a good idea to stretch hip flexors just before you surf is because if they are tight, it's going to pull us into a bit more of this anterior pelvic tilt. Cool? Not necessarily a bad thing, but it puts a lot of compression on the lumbar spine. And then when we're having to come up into this paddling position, and if you've got a stiff upper back, which is super common, they're not able to get that thoracic spine extension, then it's a huge amount of load on the lumbar spine. So detail this hip flexor stretch. Sit up in this half kneeling position, knee directly under hip, directly under shoulder. Pelvis, anterior tilt, posterior tilt. If my pelvis is a bowl, I pour water out the front. That's an anterior tilt. Posterior tilt, pouring water out of the back. I need to go into this posterior tilt. Now I'm going after iliacus, maybe a bit of psoas in there, probably some TFL. We'll get rectus femoris when we progress this. Those are all muscles on the front of the thigh, anterior hip. Generally, people just need to be here and work on this posterior tilt to feel this stretch. What will generally happen is people don't know how to control the pelvis and they'll just go forward and hinge at the lumbar spine. You see this in yoga a lot. Oh, I'm stretching my hip flexor. No, you're not. You're going into lumbar hyperextension. Really bad for people with provocative backs. So, posterior tilt, keep it there. Exhale some air, get those ribs down on top of the pelvis, controlled core. Now, if I can really go for this posterior tilt, I can then bring my hip forward about 2 to 4 centimeters. That's it. We only need to get about 10 degrees of extension out of this hip. That is a hip flexor stretch. I can then come up and reach. Another one I really like to do, maintain that posterior tilt. And we start getting into rotations of the upper body while maintaining that posterior tilt. progression, this is really just starting to involve a lot of the rectus femoris, so more of the hip flexors that also cross the knee joint. So again, you might not be able to do this at the beach, but you get the idea. If you sit a lot, often these muscles are relatively tight and constricted and kind of have lost range of motion. You might not be to this position, you might be a bit more here, but the key thing is you get that posterior tilt. Breathe. You can start adding a bit of a side lean, so leaning away from the stretch side, up and back. Good breathing, getting some abdominal contraction. Can add in some rotation. Open up the front of the hip. So there you go, 3 fundamental stretches that help to isolate specific tissues or specific areas of a joint, so then you can get into more dynamic stretches. That's what we're after. We surf, we need to move dynamically, but in order to get into some dynamic stretches, we first need to make sure we have access to those ranges of motion. So these are a couple stretches I find myself teaching over and over and over again in clinical settings and in gym settings, so there's no reason you shouldn't know how to do them. If you really want to get into some training, some stretching, some breath work, paddle workouts, and more, fitness tailored for surfers, check out the Surf Athlete app. You really will dig it. Again, I'm Chris Mills. Thanks for checking it out. Hope you dig it. Peace.